She stood at my gate, soaked through to the bone entirely, silent as a held breath, holding an infant wrapped in a shawl far too thin for the harsh weather that had clearly just tried its best to kill them both. I never once asked her name before I opened that gate. Looking back, I understand now that some decisions don't wait on the ordinary courtesies, and that a woman standing at your fence line at dusk with a baby and nothing else in the world doesn't need you to ask questions before you let her in out of the rain. My ranch sat on 1,100 acres of good Missouri grazing land along a tributary of the main river, land I'd built up over the 12 years since I'd first proved the claim, first alone, and then for 4 brief years alongside Sarah, who'd come west from Ohio with more courage than sense, by her own frequent joking admission, and who'd taken to ranch life with an enthusiasm that had made the whole hard work of those years feel considerably lighter than it would have felt done alone. The house we'd built together stood solid against weather that had tested lesser construction, a good stone chimney and 2 proper bedrooms, one of which had sat entirely unused since the winter Sarah and our son had died together, a room I passed each day without quite letting myself think too hard about what I'd once imagined it would hold. The flood had been building for 2 days by the time she reached my property, the river running high and violent enough that the crossing 11 miles east had washed out entirely, cutting the road that connected my ranch to the nearest town and stranding anyone caught on the wrong side of it. I'd spent that whole stretch of days moving stock to higher ground and shoring up the barn against water I could see creeping steadily closer to my lower pasture, and I hadn't expected, in all that grim practical work, to find a half-drowned stranger standing at my gate as the light was failing.
If I turned her away, she and the child in her arms would not survive the night in that weather, a fact that carried no doubt and required no deliberation at all. I'd seen enough hard winters and sudden storms in 12 years on that land to recognize immediately the particular danger a person in her condition faced, soaked through and temperatures dropping fast with the coming dark, no visible supplies, an infant that needed warmth even more urgently than the adult carrying it. Whatever questions I might otherwise have asked a stranger appearing unannounced at my gate dissolved entirely against that immediate practical calculation. The same instinct that had kept my stock alive through worse winters than this one, now redirected toward the 2 lives standing shivering in front of me. I got them both inside quickly, wrapped them both in every dry blanket I owned, built the fire up higher than I'd built it in years, and set clean water to warm and slowly for the baby, while the woman sat rigid and silent in my one good chair, staring at nothing, her arms locked around the infant with a grip that told me she'd sooner die than loosen it. She didn't speak that first night, not one word, not even when I offered food, not even when the baby finally settled into an exhausted sleep against her shoulder, and I asked as gently as I knew how whether she needed anything else before I banked the fire for the night. She simply shook her head, watching me with an exhaustion so complete it had gone past fear into something flatter and more dangerous, the look of a person who has used up every reserve of strength getting this far and has nothing left over for trust in a stranger's kindness, however plainly offered. I banked the fire that night and retreated to the barn loft to give her the privacy of the house's single proper bedroom, though I slept poorly, listening through the wall for any sound of the baby's distress, half convinced, despite my own exhaustion, that some further crisis might arrive before dawn on top of whatever else had brought her to my gate in this condition. The rain continued through most of that first night, softer than the driving storm of the day before, but steady enough that I understood the flood wouldn't be receding anytime soon, which meant, whatever else was true, that this silent woman and her infant charge would be under my roof for considerably longer than a single night's shelter. My own wound, the one that made her silence easier to sit with than it might have been for another man, went back 3 years to my wife Sarah's death in childbed, along with the son who would have been our first. A loss that had taught me more than I ever wanted to know about grief too large for words, and about the particular mercy of someone simply being present without demanding explanation. The fever that took Sarah had come on fast, 3 days from first symptom to the end, and the doctor who'd ridden out from town had arrived too late to do more than confirm what I'd already understood was happening. I had buried them together, wife and son, beneath a single marker on the rise behind the house, and I had spent the 3 years since learning the particular geography of a grief that never fully resolves, only changes shape season to season, sometimes a sharp, fresh wound, and sometimes a duller, more manageable ache that let a man get through his daily work without it swallowing him whole. I had spent those 3 years running the ranch alone, and I understood, watching this silent stranger clutch a baby that plainly wasn't her own by the careful, unpracticed way she held it, that whatever had brought her to my gate carried a weight not unlike the one I still carried myself. She spoke, finally, on the morning of the second day, offering only a first name, Abigail, and nothing more, though I noticed she'd begun watching the road through my front window with an anxious, searching attention that told me plainly she was afraid of something specific rather than merely displaced by the flood. I didn't press her for more than the name. I'd learned, in 3 years of my own grief, that a person tells you what they're ready to tell you, and that pushing only teaches them to guard the rest more carefully. I busied myself instead with the practical work the flood demanded, checking my stock twice daily against rising water, reinforcing the barn's lowered boards, all the while aware of Abigail's presence in the house behind me, watching from windows, tending the infant with a competence that suggested practice, even as her guardedness suggested she had reasons far beyond simple shyness for keeping her distance from a stranger's questions. The days that followed settled into a careful, watchful rhythm, the flood keeping the road impassable and both of us confined to close quarters that neither had chosen, but that neither, I noticed, seemed particularly eager to escape once the initial wariness began to ease. We fell, over those first days, into a kind of practical partnership neither of us named directly. I handled the outdoor work the flood demanded, while Abigail managed the house and the baby, and in the evenings, once Lily had settled, we sat near the same fire in a silence that gradually shifted from the wary kind to something closer to companionable. I found myself more than once offering small observations about the ranch or the weather, simply to give her something easy to respond to if she chose, and increasingly, by the second and third evenings, she did choose, brief, unguarded comments that told me, piece by careful piece, that whatever she was running from had left her badly frightened, but hadn't entirely erased the capacity for ordinary conversation. Abigail helped where she could, despite her exhaustion, tending the baby with a fierce competence that told me she'd had practice, though something in the particular way she referred to the infant, always as her or the baby, and never once as mine, kept nagging at a question I hadn't yet earned the right to ask. The first emotional peak came on the third night, when the baby, whose name I learned was Lily, spiked a fever that frightened Abigail badly enough to finally break her careful silence. She told me, sitting up with me through the worst of that fever, sponging Lily down with the same fierce competence she'd shown from the start, that Lily was her sister's child, that her sister Margaret had died at the river crossing 3 days before, swept under while trying to save the wagon their whole modest fortune had been loaded onto, and that Abigail had pulled Lily from the current herself, alone, with no one left to help her. She described the crossing itself in fragments that came harder the deeper she went into the memory. the wagon lurching sideways as the current caught it wrong, Margaret's scream cut short as the water closed over her. Abigail's own desperate scramble through cold water thick with debris, reaching blindly until her hands found the bundle that held Lily, still somehow afloat on a piece of the wagon's broken bed. She said she'd screamed Margaret's name until her voice gave out, wading the shallows, searching long after any reasonable hope had passed, and that she'd finally walked away from that crossing only because a baby who'd survived deserved better than a guardian who died herself searching for a body the river had already claimed for good. She told me, too, that they hadn't been fleeing the flood alone. They'd been fleeing Lily's father, a man named Silas Whitmore, whose treatment of Margaret had grown violent enough in the months since Lily's birth that Margaret had finally resolved to take the baby and disappear west to family neither of them had seen in years, a plan that had ended with Margaret drowned at a river crossing and Abigail alone with a promise she'd made her dying sister in the last minutes before the current took her, that whatever happened, Lily would never go back to that man.
Abigail described Silas with a controlled, careful hatred that told me she'd rehearsed keeping her voice steady while discussing him, a habit born, I understood, from years of needing to appear calm in front of a man whose temper responded badly to any visible fear or anger in the people around him. She said Margaret had married him 3 years before, drawn in by a charm that had curdled within the first year into something considerably darker, and that the violence had escalated steadily after Lily's birth, as though Silas resented the child for the attention and devotion she drew away from himself. We turned to look at each other across Lily's small sleeping form once the fever had finally broken near dawn, exhaustion and something else entirely plain on both our faces, and for a moment neither of us said anything at all. I felt something in my chest go still and waiting, the particular held breath feeling of a moment about to become something else entirely. And then a sound reached us both at once through the thinning rain. Hoofbeats, a single rider approaching slow and deliberate along the muddy road that had only just become passable enough for careful travel, and whatever had been building in that fragile dawn quiet dissolved instantly into a fear neither of us had time to name before it arrived at my door. I answered the knock to find a lean man in an expensive but travel-worn black coat standing on my porch, cold, pale eyes moving past me into my front room with a proprietary thoroughness that set every instinct I owned on immediate alert. He sat his horse before dismounting, with the particular loose confidence of a man accustomed to people arranging themselves around his convenience, and even soaked from days of hard travel, his coat and boots carried the unmistakable quality of money, a contrast against the mud-spattered practicality of every other traveler the flood had stranded along that road. I noted, with the same instinct that had once told me a storm was coming before the sky had fully committed to it, that something about his careful, controlled manner didn't match the concerned husband story he was about to offer. He introduced himself as Silas Whitmore, said he was searching for his runaway wife's sister and his infant daughter, described them both with a precision that told me plainly he'd been asking after them at every homestead along the road since the flood had first cut travelers off from town, and asked, with a politeness that didn't reach his cold eyes, whether I'd seen any sign of them. I lied to his face without a single second of hesitation, the decision arriving in me faster and more certain than any lie I'd told in my life, telling him I'd seen no travelers matching that description, that the flood had kept my own attention fixed entirely on my stock and my property, and that he'd do better checking homesteads further east where the road had cleared earlier. He studied me a long moment with those cold, pale eyes, something calculating working behind them, before he thanked me with the same hollow politeness and rode on, though I understood, watching him go, that a man like that didn't simply give up on something he considered his property, and that we hadn't seen the last of him.
I stood on that porch a long while after he'd disappeared down the muddy road, my pulse still hammering from the effort of maintaining a steady, unbothered expression through the entire exchange, and I found myself thinking, with a clarity that surprised me, that I had just lied more convincingly and with less hesitation to a stranger than I had ever managed in 36 years of otherwise honest living, and that some part of me understood exactly why the lie had come so easily. The dark turn came that same evening, once Abigail had confirmed, watching through the gap in my curtains, that Silas had indeed been Silas. She told me the fuller truth then, that Silas had beaten Margaret badly enough on 2 occasions that a doctor in their home county had quietly documented the injuries, evidence Margaret had been carrying with her sewn into the lining of a traveling bag, evidence that had gone into the river along with everything else when the wagon overturned. Without that evidence, Abigail said, and without Margaret alive to testify to any of it, Silas held every legal right in the territory to reclaim his own daughter, regardless of what danger that return might actually mean for the child. I told her I understood the fear, and that I wouldn't let him take Lily from this house without a fight, but that I needed to understand exactly what we were dealing with legally before I could promise her anything more than my own determination. The promise felt inadequate even as I made it, standing there in my own kitchen, watching her weigh whether a stranger's determination could possibly be enough against a man with Silas's resources and legal standing. But I understood, too, that offering false certainty would serve neither of us well if the actual legal fight proved as difficult as I suspected it might. I told her plainly that I'd spend whatever it took, in time and money both, to give her the strongest possible case, and that whatever the eventual outcome, she wouldn't be facing it alone, the way she'd faced the river crossing and everything since. She looked at me with something between gratitude and a fresh wave of the same fear that had brought her silent and soaked to my gate 3 days before, and told me she'd spent every mile of the journey west rehearsing exactly this conversation, and that she still didn't have a clean answer for how a woman with no legal standing and no surviving evidence was supposed to protect a child the law itself might hand back to her killer.
That conversation left something raw and unresolved between us for 2 full days, both of us moving carefully around a problem neither could fully solve with will alone. I rode, once the roads had cleared enough for safe travel, to the county seat to consult with a lawyer I'd known since before Sarah's death, a careful, thorough man named Hollis, who listened to the whole account with a gravity that told me he understood the stakes as clearly as I did. Hollis had handled the paperwork on my original land claim years before, and I'd trusted his judgment enough since to send him occasional business regarding stock contracts and boundary disputes, though nothing in our previous dealings had prepared either of us for a conversation about custody law and documented spousal abuse. He listened without interrupting through the whole account, taking careful notes in a leather ledger, and when I'd finished, he told me plainly that territorial custody law generally favored a surviving parent's rights strongly, that Abigail's position as an aunt with no legal standing beyond moral conviction was considerably weaker than either of us would have liked, but that documented evidence of abuse, if it could be assembled and verified, might be enough to overcome that presumption in front of the right judge. The turning point came from Hollis's own research, conducted over several careful days, while Abigail and I waited at the ranch in a state of anxious, watchful patience. Hollis discovered that the doctor who'd treated Margaret's injuries in their home county was still practicing there, still had his own private records of the examinations, even though Margaret's own copies had been lost in the river, and was willing, once Hollis explained the stakes plainly, to provide sworn testimony regarding the pattern and severity of injuries he'd documented over 2 separate visits. Hollis discovered, too, that Silas had a documented history of similar complaints from a previous marriage, records that had never been formally pursued, but that existed nonetheless, waiting to be assembled into the kind of pattern no territorial judge could easily dismiss. The previous wife, Hollis learned through careful correspondence with a colleague in the county where Silas had first married, had left him after less than 2 years, filing a formal complaint with the local sheriff that had gone nowhere at the time, given her own family's reluctance to pursue a public scandal against a man of Silas's standing, but that remained on record nonetheless, gathering dust in a filing cabinet until Hollis's letter arrived asking pointed questions about exactly the kind of pattern it represented. Hollis wrote to me with an uncharacteristic note of grim satisfaction that a man who'd counted on his money and reputation to bury one woman's complaint had inadvertently left a paper trail that would now help bury his custody claim entirely.
I found Abigail in the kitchen the evening Hollis's letter arrived with this news, and I told her everything, watching relief and disbelief war across her face as the reality of an actual legal path forward settled in. I told her, too, something I'd been circling for the better part of 2 weeks without finding the courage to say plainly, that whatever happened with the custody proceedings, I wanted her and Lily to stay, not as guests weathering out a flood or a legal crisis, but as the family I hadn't let myself imagine having again since Sarah died. She was quiet a long moment at that kitchen table, Lily asleep in a cradle I built from scrap lumber in the evenings since the fever night, before she told me something that reframed the whole 3 weeks between us. The cradle itself had become something of a quiet symbol between us without either naming it that way. I'd started it the night after Lily's fever broke, unable to sleep and needing something to occupy restless hands, and I'd continued the work through several subsequent evenings, sanding and fitting the small pieces with a care I hadn't put into any project since finishing the nursery Sarah and I had planned together years before. Abigail had watched me work on it several evenings without comment, though I'd noticed her expression softening each time she checked on its progress, and I understood, looking back, that the cradle had been doing some of the same work of trust building that our careful conversations were doing, just through different, quieter means. She said she'd spent every night since the river took Margaret, certain that she'd used up whatever capacity she had left for trusting anyone, that the promise to protect Lily had become the only thing organizing her whole existence, with no room left over for anything as complicated as her own wanting. She said watching me stand at my own door and lie without hesitation to a dangerous man, and then watching me spend 2 weeks quietly, patiently building an actual legal defense rather than simply promising vague protection, had taught her that some men's steadiness wasn't the same as her own late father's cold indifference, that it could instead be a kind of devotion she hadn't let herself believe still existed in the world. She told me, too, about her father, a detail she hadn't shared before that evening, a man who'd provided adequately for his daughters materially, while remaining almost entirely absent emotionally, present at the dinner table, but never truly present in any way that mattered, a pattern that had left both Margaret and Abigail, in different ways, primed to mistake charm for genuine care when Silas first came courting Margaret. She said watching me build the cradle, unasked and unannounced, in careful evening hours after long days of ranch work and legal preparation both, had shown her something about quiet devotion that her father's example had never once demonstrated, and that she'd found herself, somewhere in those weeks, no longer bracing for the moment my patience would run out the way she'd learned to expect from every man she'd previously known. The resolution came together over the following month, built not on a single dramatic confrontation, but on careful, deliberate legal work. Hollis worked methodically through those weeks, corroborating the doctor's records with additional testimony from neighbors in Margaret and Silas's home county who'd witnessed enough of the marriage's deterioration to offer supporting accounts. Careful and unglamorous work that nonetheless built, piece by piece, a picture no reasonable judge could dismiss as simple grieving sister overreach. I rode to town more times that month than I had in the previous year combined, ferrying documents and messages between Hollis's office and the ranch, while Abigail, for her part, wrote out her own detailed account of everything she'd witnessed over the 3 years of Margaret's marriage, a document Hollis said would carry particular weight given its first-hand, consistent detail. Hollis filed a formal custody petition on Abigail's behalf, supported by the doctor's sworn testimony and the pattern evidence from Silas's previous marriage. And though Silas fought the petition with considerable resources and an expensive lawyer of his own, the accumulated weight of documented abuse proved more than even his money could fully overcome. The territorial judge, a careful and unceremonial man named Pierce, granted Abigail formal guardianship of Lily that autumn, with explicit provisions barring Silas from any unsupervised contact, a ruling that Silas received with a cold fury that convinced everyone in that courtroom, including Judge Pierce himself, of exactly the kind of man he actually was. The hearing itself had stretched across 2 full days, Silas's expensive lawyer presenting a polished narrative of a grieving father wrongfully separated from his only child by a hysterical sister-in-law and rancher accomplice, a story that might have carried more weight if the doctor's calm, precise testimony about the specific pattern and severity of Margaret's injuries hadn't directly contradicted every claim of a peaceful, loving marriage. I watched Abigail testify on the second day, her voice steady despite visible strain, describing in plain, unembellished detail exactly what she'd witnessed over 3 years of watching her sister's marriage deteriorate. And I understood, watching Judge Pierce's expression shift from careful neutrality to something closer to grim conviction, that the accumulated weight of truth had finally overcome whatever advantage Silas's money and polish had initially provided. Abigail and Lily stayed on at the ranch through that whole process and well beyond it, the 3 of us settling into a household that had begun in crisis and slowly, deliberately built itself into something neither Abigail nor I had let ourselves hope for again after our respective losses. I asked her properly the following spring, once the custody matter was fully and permanently settled, whether she'd consider making the arrangement permanent in every sense, and she told me, with a directness that had become entirely characteristic of her by then, that she'd been waiting for me to ask since sometime around the night Hollis's letter arrived with news of the doctor's testimony. I'd planned the actual asking with considerably more ceremony than it ultimately received. I'd intended to wait for a particular evening, perhaps with some small gesture to mark the occasion properly, but the question ended up arriving instead on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon while we stood together at the corral fence watching Lily take her first unsteady steps across the yard, the moment simply presenting itself with an obviousness that made any more elaborate plan feel unnecessary. Abigail's answer came just as plainly, delivered with the same steady directness I'd come to rely on in her since that first difficult week, and neither of us saw any particular need to dress the moment up as anything grander than the simple, settled certainty it actually was. We were married that summer, a small ceremony at the ranch, with Hollis standing as witness and Judge Pierce, of all people, riding out to attend, having become, in the months since the custody hearing, something considerably warmer toward both of us than his careful courtroom manner had first suggested. The wedding itself was modest by most standards, held in the same front room where I'd once sat up through Lily's fever-racked 3rd night, not knowing whether the story would end in tragedy or something else entirely. A handful of neighbors attended, most of them people who'd only learned the full story once it had reached the newspapers during the custody hearing, and who'd shown up as much out of curiosity as genuine celebration, though whatever their initial motives, most left that afternoon convinced they'd witnessed something worth the ride out. Hollis gave a short, characteristically precise toast about the particular satisfaction of watching a case built on careful, unglamorous documentation result in an outcome that mattered considerably more than any legal fee could measure. And Judge Pierce, considerably looser with a glass of cider in hand than he'd ever appeared on the bench, observed that he'd presided over a good many custody matters in his years, but few that had left him quite so certain he'd ruled correctly. Lily, not yet 2, spent most of the ceremony trying to eat a handful of wildflowers someone had left within her reach, entirely unbothered by the significance of the occasion unfolding around her. I think sometimes still about that first night, the particular silence of a woman standing at my gate with a baby that wasn't hers and a grief too large to speak aloud, and how close the whole of what came after had come to never happening at all, if I'd hesitated even a few minutes at that gate, if the flood had cut the road a mile further along instead of stopping her exactly at my fence line. I've turned that particular geography over in my mind more times than I could count over the years since, the exact mile marker where the road had washed out, the specific stretch of fence line where she'd finally stopped, unable to walk any further, the precise timing that had brought her to my gate rather than any of the half-dozen other homesteads along that same stretch of road. Abigail has told me, on the rare occasions she discusses that walk at all, that she'd chosen my gate for no more sophisticated reason than seeing a light still burning in a window when every other visible homestead along that stretch had already gone dark for the night. A small, arbitrary detail that had nonetheless decided the entire shape of both our lives afterward. Abigail says she doesn't dwell on those close calls the way I sometimes still do, that a woman who spent 3 weeks running from an impossible danger has less patience for imagining the endings that didn't happen than for simply being grateful, every single day, for the one that did. I told her once that I still didn't fully understand what had made me open that gate so readily, before I'd asked a single question, before I'd known anything at all about who she was or what she carried. She said she thought I'd understood exactly what mattered the moment I saw her standing there soaked and silent with a child in her arms, and that everything else, all the legal battles and careful patience and slow-built trust that followed, had simply been the long way of proving what I had already decided that first night at the gate. Lily calls me Papa now, has for 2 years, and calls Abigail Mama in the same unhesitating way children do when a family has simply become the truth of their lives rather than an arrangement anyone still thinks to explain. I've stopped, mostly, thinking of that first flooded week as a crisis we survived, and started thinking of it instead as the beginning of the only family I ever expected to have again. The room that had sat empty since Sarah's death now holds Lily's small bed, painted a cheerful yellow Abigail chose the first spring after the wedding. And I find, walking past that doorway most evenings on my way to check the children before sleep, that the particular ache I once associated with it has softened into something closer to gratitude. Not that the original grief has been replaced or forgotten entirely, but that the empty space it once occupied has proven capable, after all, of holding new life alongside the old loss, rather than being defined entirely by what was missing from it. We added a second child of our own 2 years after the wedding, a boy we named Thomas after Abigail's father, and Lily took to the role of older sister with the same fierce, protective competence she'd once shown carrying her cousin through a flood, watching over the cradle with an attentiveness that made both Abigail and me exchange more than one quiet, knowing look across the room. The ranch itself has prospered steadily in the years since, the 1,100 acres now running more cattle than I had ever managed alone, work that feels considerably lighter still for having someone to share both the labor and the particular evening quiet that follows a long day of it, the two of us settling most nights onto the same porch where I once stood answering a stranger's dangerous questions, Now watching two children chase fireflies across a yard that has long since felt like the site of anything but ordinary, hard-won happiness. Abigail keeps in a small cedar box on our bedroom dresser the torn gray shawl she was wearing the night she arrived at my gate, along with a single pressed wildflower from Lily's 10th birthday and a copy of Judge Pierce's original custody ruling. Three objects that together tell the whole shape of the story better than either of us has ever managed to explain it fully to anyone who asks, better even than this account, which I've written down now mostly so that Lily and Thomas both might read it someday and understand exactly how much a flooded road and a stranger's willingness to open a gate can end up mattering to an entire family's future. She takes it out sometimes on quiet evenings and looks through its contents without any particular sadness, the way a person revisits a hard chapter of their life once they've reached the part of the story that finally makes the hard chapter bearable, even worthwhile to remember clearly.